Hey everyone, Emily Jashinsky here, culture editor at The Federalist. Excited to kick back off with some of our live coverage. I'll be joined this week by some of my colleagues, so please subscribe on the Federalist YouTube channel so that you can stay up to date. You'll never miss a video. We've got a lot of good stuff lately. This is the RNC pre-show. The RNC is set to begin really soon. It's on the heels of last week's historic virtual DNC, the first virtual political convention that we've ever really seen. We've had a lot of coverage of the DNC here. I think it was extremely boring, which for the Democratic Party was a success because they were trying to make Joe Biden seem like a safe choice. Don't rock the boat. Go back to 2015, 2016, Obama-Biden's America. Go with Joe. We're going to stick light on policy. What we talk about in terms of policy is going to be very kind of muted and vague. That's what they did. It was like watching paint dry, even though they were able to, get Hollywood actresses, A-list Hollywood actresses roped into their effort. It was just incredibly boring, but I think for them, ratings were down, by the way. I think for them, that's fine. I do not, however, think low ratings is fine for Donald Trump. I don't think he wants to have a low-rated RNC. I think he wants to really put on a compelling show. What else would you expect from Donald John Trump? And so from what we've heard about the RNC's plans, they want to do fireworks. And I think an important thing here is they want to incorporate a live element much more than the DNC was able to. It did seem like the Democrats figured out they needed to do some live stuff more by the end of those 4 nights, which I guess is to be expected. This was all a grand experiment in the virtual convention, and we didn't end up seeing the 1968 chaos and violence that the convention had in Chicago all those years ago, although we are seeing violence in the streets actually of Kenosha, not far from where I grew up, in cities like Denver, cities like Portland still. And I think it was remarkable. We didn't hear anything about that from the Democrats. They did not address the protests and the riots. The Republicans will. The convention happening against the backdrop of violence is going to be a big theme of it. And that brings me really to the broader point that I wanted to cover on the stream, is that this is going to be a culture war convention. Bet your ass it's going to be a culture war convention. There was a really interesting story in the Daily Beast actually last week that cited some anonymous sources from 2016 Trump world who were disappointed that the president seemed to have abandoned the populism and the populist wave that he rode to the nomination, the GOP nomination in 2015 and 16, and that ultimately delivered the presidency to him in November of 2016. This is really interesting. They were complaining that he's talking about the boat parades, which I imagine, and they probably imagine, boat parades are more upper middle class than working class, and capital gains tax. Is that a populist message? Is that what's going to win? And I do think it's true that we've seen him kind of speak less about issues like immigration. But one of his advisors in that article is quoted as saying, "We don't have the rallies." The rallies are where that sort of populist message was on display. So is what we're going to see this week basically a return of the vintage Trump rally, the populist show that he's been putting on for 5 years, or will that be kind of reined in by the Republican establishment that is he's built that Republican establishment infrastructure around him? What are we going to see? I think if we look at the speaker lineup, we are going to see we're going to see a culture war speaker list, like the McCloskeys, the so-called gun couple from St. Louis. They're speaking, and that's fascinating, right? That they were someone who they went viral in a negative way. The left was really kind of, I think probably a good word would be, the left was sort of fully disgusted with what they saw. They were kind of depicting them as racists and all of that. And sorry, just getting these graphics together here. That's how they were really depicted in the media. But was that actually what the public saw from them? I don't know if that's the case, and I think that's what Republicans are banking on, probably rightfully. And so that's when we're talking about this being a culture war convention. That's really what we're talking about here. This is a culture war convention because you're going to have the Republicans who have, under Trump, realized that the culture war is something they can fully lean into. And that's, I think, what we're going to see. Some people, like, we've seen some early sort of indications that there might be a lot of focus on the economy. There are, of course, populist ways to talk about the economy. But I do think we're going to see a lot of stuff like the McCloskeys. Nicholas Sandmann is scheduled to speak. Now, Nicholas Sandmann was the Covington Catholic kid who successfully sued CNN. I always say a really important part of understanding Trumpism, and I usually explain this to people on the left. When we think about a traditional political platform or a traditional campaign platform, we often think about very specific policies. And if you go to a politician's website and you click on their little platform tab, that's often what you see. But with Donald Trump, a huge part of his policy, you can basically add this to his platform. If you were to go on a website that had, a true representation of the Trump platform, what you should see there is anti-media bias and anti-political correctness, and just generally sort of anti-elites. But the anti-media bias is such a huge part of the Trump platform, and it's such a huge part of what brought people in the Rust Belt, those Obama-Trump voters that the Democrats are trying to make Obama-Trump-Biden voters. You just don't see the Democrats really handling the culture war as it relates to that kind of working class, persuadable working class middle, in the way that they can't really do that, right? Because they got away with a lot last week. There was no live element. There was no base of Democratic delegates to kneel when the national anthem was played, for instance. And that made them lean really hard into patriotism because they could get away with it. That's not what they can do in like the everyday Democratic Party anymore. So they have a sort of tough time culturally appealing to those Obama-Trump voters, because that sort of far left fringe element of their base that has now been mainstreamed into the Democratic Party just is wildly intolerant of it. So I think what we're going to see from Republicans is really leaning into the law and order theme. Like we mentioned earlier on the stream, that's going to be a huge element of this convention. When you have their incorporation of speakers like the McCloskeys and Nicholas Sandmann, I mean, oh my goodness, you can see where they're going. At the same time, of course, Republicans, unlike Democrats, have no control over the headlines, right? Like, there's never a Republican who's able to say, I can predict what sort of takeaway or what angle is going to be at the top of Politico playbook the next morning in the way Nancy Pelosi probably can. It's basically the Pelosi playbook at this point. Which makes it actually pretty helpful if you want to, find out what Nancy Pelosi's playbook is. But Republicans, of course, don't have that level of control over their public relations and over what the left is spinning or what the media is spinning in the same way the Democrats do. So that's a huge disadvantage. But President Trump is actually pretty good at manipulating the media to get the headlines that he wants by talking about one thing or then pivoting to another thing. And so I think there's a reason that you have people like the McCloskeys and the Nicholas Sandmann showing up, and it's because Republicans want to lean into that culture war that's going to help them compete with those sort of increasingly economically disenfranchised working class people who are suffering in the middle of this pandemic, but realize that they want them to realize that they can't trust Democrats to implement a policy that will actually be beneficial to them and their families. And I think that's what that's what the strategy behind the culture war convention is. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe these speakers are just sort of added and they're not actually going to be, there'll be more footnotes. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm thinking, if Donald Trump has as much control over this as I imagine he made sure that he does have, we are going to see a culture war convention. We may see this pandemic era populism, which I don't think we really have had much of a glimpse at from President Trump so far, because, so far it's been a lot of, talking about the economy and talking about the medical part of the pandemic, which obviously he's the president of the United States, so it's what his job is to focus on and talk about. But in this political capacity, I think if we're expecting resurgent populism from President Trump, we're expecting a focus on the culture war. I'm going to be interested to see how that very specific flavor of populism for the pandemic emerges, because this pandemic has affected so many people in so many different ways, but a lot of people in one very specific way, which is seriously. So I think we're going to see something emerge, and it'll also be helpful as a glimpse into the future of the Republican Party. What we see at this convention from sort of younger people who embrace whatever you call it, Trumpism, and as you can see right here, Nikki Haley is a good example. She's someone who kind of pushed back against the pro-Trump nationalist clique of thinkers and policymakers here in DC recently, and kind of gave a defense of Reaganomics, if that's what you want to call it. I'm really curious to see what she talks about tonight. I think Tim Scott is going to give a fascinating speech as we, again, violence over protests that are turning violent over racial strife. I think Tim Scott is going to have an interesting perspective on that. And Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, by the way, were in office representing South Carolina when the terrible Charleston church shooting occurred. So they both have kind of, they both are able to talk about those things. I think some people don't like the way that someone like Nikki Haley might talk about them. So we're going to see an interesting kind of display in the evolution of the Republican Party in late August 2020, tonight at the Republican National Convention. One thing we haven't talked about is aesthetically what it's going to look like. The Democrats had a lot of these overproduced, very ad-feeling videos, like with the warm lighting and soft focus and all of that, all of that good stuff. There's a lot of overproduction. Even their live videos were sort of like, I keep using the word overproduced, and that's what they felt like, because you want to have some sort of like feeling of immediacy and unpredictability to make compelling television. Donald Trump knows that, by the way. That's why, again, the networks in 2015 had great ratings from his rallies, because nobody knew what the man was going to say. And that's why you stuck around for 3 hours or however long he spoke for at some of those rallies. You just stuck around because you had no idea what the next thing that he was going to say would be. Is he going to say that we're going to make sure everybody has health care? Is he going to say Hillary Clinton should be in prison? You don't know, so you're not touching the dial. And Donald Trump understands that better than anybody in politics, and he's also more comfortable with that than anybody in politics. I'm sure a lot of people in Republican politics, in fact, I know a lot of people in Republican politics are not comfortable with that, especially in the way that Donald Trump is. But aesthetically, I do think Republicans will be smart enough. We know they're using like Fort McHenry as a backdrop. Okay, last week we saw Nancy Pelosi speaking, and by the way, 2 weeks of political conventions. This is not just soda. Nancy Pelosi speaking against this sort of San Francisco backdrop. Republicans want to use Fort McHenry. Some of the convention is here in D.C. They kind of want the drama of these iconic American landscapes. And not that San Francisco isn't that, but I think Republicans are making more of an effort to not be in a situation where they have this ridiculous video of someone like John Kasich on like standing between two different dirt paths and making some sort of like bizarre speech about being at a crossroads ideologically or something. Like, I couldn't even listen to it because it made me so embarrassed for the poor man. But it was just like it was a lot of overproduction. And I think Republicans will have a well-produced, they have talented videographers and creative people. They don't have all of Hollywood at their disposal, but I do think that it'll have more of a feeling of immediacy, and it'll have more of an element of unpredictability. It will feel more live. They have such a benefit of being able to go after the Democrats, which is really nice because that's, they got to see what worked and what didn't work. And, they might even know, they might even look at the nights where the ratings were lower than others and where people tuned back in. I mean, Republicans can't roll out Michelle Obama and Barack Obama and Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Kerry Washington and all of these darlings of Hollywood and the media. Does that work? Does that draw eyeballs? Probably, but they also were very unscripted. It was a very scripted presentation. It was very vague. It was very sort of like, there was this weird incoherency and disconnect between the picture of America that they were painting, which a lot of people saw as kind of cynical and dark and glass half empty, and then the patriotism that they were just eagerly embracing, and these sort of beautiful renditions of the national anthem or America the Beautiful. I mean, from the Republicans, I think we'll see a lot of the same patriotism, but will we see the picture of American carnage? I think that's a really important question in speeches President Trump gave last week, like in Minnesota. I think we started to feel notes of American carnage, and that's a reference, of course, to the speech he made at his inauguration in early 2017, which was jarring for a lot of the media, talking about American carnage in our streets. Well, that's because a lot of the media doesn't live or regularly visit some of those Rust Belt towns that have been decimated by our trade relationship with China, by the loss of manufacturing jobs, where there are, where opioid addiction is rampant and alcoholism is rampant. And we're starting to see more of that, creep into the urban areas in the city. And there's obviously a huge conversation right now about all the people fleeing New York City. California and New York are both examples of states and cities that are suffering immensely under these leftist policies. How much is that going to get talked about? I don't know. So the convention is underway. I'm curious to see how things start playing out. Stay tuned. We'll have a lot of coverage here on our Federalist YouTube. Please subscribe. We are putting up a lot more videos these days because we want to reach people in the pandemic when a lot of us are, stuck at home with so many businesses being closed and so many of our entertainment options being closed. So we're trying to reach everybody more on video, but enjoy the RNC. Pass along any comments or questions that you have and you'd like us to answer. I think the show is underway, so enjoy it and